Hello everyone, this is Meesha Tandon from Delhi, India. I am an architect and urban development expert, and I also have expertise in the water sector. Today I'm going to talk to you about water and climate change from an integrated water resource management perspective. I am a Commonwealth shared scholar from the year 2006-2007. I did my master's in Catchment Dynamics and Management from University of Leeds, UK. Presently, I'm working as an independent consultant on aspects related to urban development, climate change, water resource management, urban governance, and others. And I also have my NGO working towards climate change awareness and sustainable development, uh, primarily targeting awareness generation amongst youth. And now, in the post-COVID era, we also intend to take up some on-ground activities.
I'll take a minute to introduce the organization. We work towards sustainable development and climate change, especially in the adaptation sector. Our vision is to mainstream sustainable development for climate preparedness of every citizen. We are conducting this program called Mission 2030 with the aim of building more climate leaders in India, especially amongst the youth. More leaders like Greta. So, with that idea, we have conducted several training programs across various states with school and college students, and around 400 students have been reached out till date. And we intend to take it much further beyond this. And you guys are most welcome to join.
So today I'm going to talk about some basic concepts of climate change which will help you understand climate change better. We'll talk about the potential impacts of climate change on the water sector, and we also talk about what can we do, especially from an integrated water resource management perspective. I will also be talking about some of my work that I'm doing in this sector, and my talk today will largely focus on climate change aspects related to India.
So now, why is it that we should be worried about climate change? The main reason is that because it is impacting the weather patterns globally and it is causing very, very significant changes. Some extreme events which used to happen once in 100 years or once in 50 years are now happening once in 10 years or once in 5 years. So, whenever you use historic records to anticipate what can happen in the future, that probably is not going to be correct anymore because the patterns are changing so erratically and so frequently. There is the component of sea level rise. Globally, the water levels across the oceans are increasing because, as you might be aware, there is a lot of Arctic ice melt, that glacial melt that is happening, that is adding to the volume of water, and also because there is a lot of carbon in the atmosphere which the oceans are absorbing, and that is also leading to acidification of the oceans as well. And it is also this acidification is also adversely impacting the marine life that is there, the aquatic life that is there. Now, impacts on temperature and precipitation patterns are being witnessed globally. There are extreme events which are becoming more erratic and more frequent, like floods, droughts, storms, cyclones, thunderstorms, and many others. As you can see, these are images from the Chennai floods of 2015, and you can compare. The same city is facing floods also and extreme droughts also in the form of 0 day. Now, as I mentioned, this is an image from what you might have heard about in the news recently, the Chennai Zero Day. Now, what is 0 day for those of you who do not know? 0 day basically indicates that it is the day when the reservoirs in the city do not have any water left to supply to the city. So that is what it indicates. The water reservoirs dried out in the city of Chennai. It is to some extent fault in the way we are managing water and the way our urban water bodies are getting encroached. and but at the same time there is also a very strong component of heating and temperature changes and the erratic climate patterns that is causing this. We are seeing so many erratic cyclones happening. Funny happened in April 2019, which led to a lot of damage across Orissa. Vayu in 2019 again, but thankfully that did not make landfall in India. Recently, we have Amphan, which is creating havoc in Bengal and some parts of Orissa. So these kind of cyclones are also increasing. There was a recent study done by one of the firms in US that projected the impacts of sea level rise on Mumbai by 2050, and we can see large parts of Mumbai are likely to get submerged because of the rising sea level, and that is going to lead to a lot of damage and losses. So basically, if we do not want the impacts of climate change to get more and more adverse, we need to control this temperature rise to 1.5 degrees of the pre-industrial levels. Now, why is this needed is because if the temperature rises beyond this point, there is a possibility that if it crosses around 3 or 4 degrees, the impacts that it might cause might just be irreversible. It might cause that much of damage to ecosystems and various other factors across the planet. Now, even if it reaches around 2 degrees, the temperature is going to lead to several erratic events and extreme events and adverse impacts, but that can still be mitigated. However, what we need to try is to maintain it at 1.5 degrees. Presently, we are at 1.1 degrees, and as you can see, it's the temperature rises higher above land and less over oceans.
So, what is it that we can do? There have been certain key goals that have been defined at a global level. There are three main here. The first one is that we should limit the global average temperature to 1.5 degrees, as I discussed just in the previous slide. Then the second one is that by 2030, the CO2 emission reduction should be 45% of 2010 levels. Now, what this means is that around 7.6% reduction in CO2 emissions should be achieved every year. And we should try and become carbon neutral latest by 2050. Some countries are even trying for 2030, but 2050 is definitely required. As you might have heard, the latest report of IPCC suggests that we are heading on a track whereby achieving 1.5 degrees might not be possible unless we take drastic measures. Some of you might have also heard that India has set itself a target of achieving carbon neutrality by 2070. And this is being looked at, uh, you know, differently. We are getting some mixed reactions on this. Some people are saying that 2070 might be too late in the day, but some people are saying that since India's emissions per capita are not that high, it might be good to have a target year at least. You know, you can always revise your targets year and target year and try and achieve that early. But having a target year is a very important step, especially, you know, India being one of the developing nations that have not contributed so much to climate emissions, whereas the developed nations need to contribute more to curtailing this growth in emissions.
Another major international framework is the Sustainable Development Goals, which were established in 2015. These supersede the Millennium Development Goals. These were formulated by the UN as an agenda to achieve by 2030, and with the idea of promoting sustainable development for all. So these sort of goals have separate goals dedicated to water, which is goal number 6, and climate action, which is goal number 13. But if we look at it directly or indirectly, all of these goals are impacted by climate change or water in one way or the other. So, although there is no formal mechanism linking the Sustainable Development Goals with the Paris Agreement, water is definitely an underlying feature that has the potential to integrate these agreements.
So now looking at the potential impacts of climate change on India, there's likely to be an increase in the average seasonal temperature by 3 to 4.5 degrees Celsius. Now this means a lot for a country like India, which is already facing heat stress and other issues related to increase in temperature. The precipitation and intensity is likely to increase. Intensity means that you'll get more rainfall over a shorter duration, which is likely to lead to increase in floods, and that is a problem for India, which already faces extreme floods during monsoons, especially. Extreme precipitation events are also likely to increase by 5 to 10% in the future. And this can have severe implications on a country like India, where most of the agriculture is dependent on rainfalls, especially the monsoon rainfalls for sustenance. So food security can become a concern if there is an increase in floods and droughts in the future. Nearly 5% of India's population is likely to face water scarcity by 2100. The percentage might seem small, but the absolute number would be exorbitant in terms of the number of people that will face water scarcity. And extreme floods and droughts in India might increase.
If you look at the global water use, it has increased 6 times over the last 100 years, and the rate of growth is approximately 1% per year. As I discussed earlier, some of the key impacts of climate change include hydrological changes in the water cycle across the globe, which is significantly impacting seasonal water availability across the world. Again, if we look at the areas which are going to be vulnerable, it is likely that the areas between the tropics are going to be the most vulnerable, and that includes a lot of developing countries. Another significant category that is going to be likely to be impacted is the small island developing states. Um, and some of the other projections across the world include that there are going to be significant glacial melts, be it Arctic, be it probably this can even happen in the Himalayas, although a lot of research and debate is going on in this aspect. But it is definitely happening in the polar regions. Drylands are likely to intensify across the world, and that is going to be a problem for countries like ours, where agriculture is a major determinant. So I'll quickly go over this diagram of hydrological processes operating in a catchment. Basically, when you get precipitation in the form of rain or snow, if you have a tree cover in the form of, say, a forest area, then the rainfall is intercepted by the tree canopy, which reduces the amount of rainfall that immediately reaches the ground. And this is very useful, especially in a country like ours where the rainfall intensity is very high, because then the rain gradually reaches the soil and the soil is able to take in more water as compared to similar piece of land without a tree cover, where the rainfall will fall directly. So once this infiltration through the soil happens, water percolates inside and reaches the water table if it's able to reach the saturated zone, or it forms a part of the unconfined aquifer, which is closer to the ground. Now, when it continues to rain and there's no infiltration happening any further, then you get what is called as runoff generation, which means that water starts flowing over the surface, and it leads to runoff generation, which goes and meets a stream or a lake or the ocean, or even forms a depression storage. And there is also movement within the soil that happens in the form of interflow, and this interflow can possibly reach a lake or an ocean nearby. So all these hydrological processes that are happening at the level of a catchment can get impacted by climate change quite significantly. This can be in the form of floods because climate change is going to lead to more and more flooding because more and more rainfall is going to be concentrated over lesser number of days, and also the intensity of the rainfall is going to be higher. So floods are likely to increase, droughts are likely to increase because once you have more incessant rainfall, more rainfall intensity, and it's concentrated over lesser number of days, then you get a lesser chance for percolation. Your catchment is likely to run dry, and because rising temperatures are also going to be having some adverse impacts on the vegetation that you have. So this, in a way, is also going to lead to lower soil moisture availability, and also that can impact your water table. And when your water table goes down, it can also lead to, higher concentration of pollutants. It can also lead to cyclones and storms in your catchment, which can impact the hydrological cycle. And obviously, impacts like these can lead to result in water conflicts. So now let's look at integrated water resource management. Is this a new concept, especially in the Indian subcontinent? So, if you look to the left, you can see images from Dholavira. This is in Gujarat. This is a part of the Indus Valley civilization. It has been termed as having one of the most sophisticated water conservation systems of channels and reservoirs, one of the earliest in the world. So, the settlement had three large reservoirs, and there were a lot of them that were excavated underground, and these reservoirs were used to store the rainwater directly and also to divert the water that was flowing in the rivulets close to the city, to the settlement. To the right you can see images of the great bath from Mohenjo-daro. That settlement had 700 wells at that time, which is the highest number in the world at that time. It had drainage system, sewerage system, water supply, and the earliest public bath in the ancient world. So we definitely had an understanding of this approach. However, we need to re-look at it and re-understand it. Even until pretty recently, you have such examples which can be seen, which show that India has traditionally had this knowledge. Here I'm sharing a case from Rajasthan where there was a series of interlinked ponds. Even in that desert area, there was an understanding of how the catchment is behaving, how the water will flow, and how it can be channelized and stored. So for example, I'll just show here. You can see there's some bunding which has been done to tap the water here, and this is Gadisar Lake, which is the largest lake in Jaisalmer. It's a man-made lake, and from here you had water flowing into Govindsar, the overflow, and then from Govindsar there was a provision for the water to go into Gulab Sagar, and there are more such interlinked ponds in Jaisalmer. I'm only talking about three, but there are more. And not just in Jaisalmer, you have so many cities of India which have had these interlinked ponds. You can find them in Madhya Pradesh, you can find them in Karnataka. These are spread all over the country, and this is the kind of wisdom we have had. We have had this understanding that we need to tap the water and we need to utilize the excess.
We have traditionally had the system of gram panchayats or the village councils wherein decisions have been taken collectively through a democratic way, and water has been a part of these discussions. This system of democratic decision making has also led to the 73rd and the 74th Constitutional Amendment Acts, wherein the decision making powers have been devolved to the local level of governments.
Let's try and understand what IWRM means in the present day context. Today, the concept of IWRM, Integrated Water Resources Management, is based on Dublin Principles. Now, these are a set of principles which advocate that fresh water is finite and vulnerable, and it is essential to sustain life, development, and environment. All three are important: life, development, environment. Water management and development should be participatory, and it should involve the users. So that is where it advocates the participatory approach. Women play a central role, and water has economic value. All competing users should be considered as economic goods. So these are the basic principles. I've just written a gist of these principles, but yeah, these are the governing principles of the concept of IWRM. Okay, so now let's look at the 7 principles of IWRM. The first one is that you should try and manage water resources at the lowest possible level. For example, we have the central government, we have the state government. In India, state government has the power to manage water resources within their boundaries, because water is a state subject in India. Under the 73rd and the 74th Constitutional Amendment Act, more powers have been decentralized to the urban local bodies or the municipalities, and the rural local bodies or the panchayats. So, this also includes how they manage water locally. The question is now, do we also need to look at another tier wherein the community and the citizens play an active role in managing the water resources?
Okay, so the next principle of IWRM focuses on optimizing supply and managing demand. Now, till now, our approach has been towards supply management, wherein we have tried to dam as many rivers as we can, make as many reservoirs as possible. But as we can all see all around us, this is leading to increasing water conflicts all across the world. Now, what we need to be mindful of is that this is no longer a sustainable solution. We have had cities in Rajasthan getting water supply from the Ganga basin without realizing the value of that water. Rajasthan itself has had this traditional wealth of rainwater harvesting structures like tankas, bawdis, and wells, which have lived them through centuries of droughts. But with the advent of water supply, the relevance of these structures is, being lost. And that is what people need to realize, that you need such systems and structures, localized rainwater harvesting structures, to complement the supply that you're already getting. What we also need to be mindful of is that Indian cities have almost 50% leakage losses. Now, one person had once said that water saved is equal to a water body created. So you can imagine how many water bodies we're losing out on every day. We also need to understand that though we have prescribed standards like 135 LPCD, 70 LPCD for supply to cities, we need to understand that we need to be more efficient. We need to start looking at demand management, because it might not be a privilege for all cities to keep on having this kind of water supply for a very, very long time if we continue with our existing trends. We need to start focusing on demand management, and we need to start determining how we can best use the water that we have.
So, another principle is that you need to provide equitable access to water resources through participatory and transparent governance and management. Now, basically, essentially, you need to firstly look at equitability of access, which means that the poorest of the poor and the richest of the rich should have equal right to access water. I would even add that, even animals and birds and, other ecological users should also be considered. For example, in this image to the left, you can see how people in Indian cities have traditionally been building these small tankas for cows and other animals to drink water from, establishing improved and integrated policy, regulatory, and institutional frameworks. So basically, this calls for integration, the systems approach that we've been talking about. That is very, very important. You have a lot of silos happening, and they need to start working together. You need to regulate better, and you need more improved institutional frameworks for this to work. Now, the next principle is that there is a need to use a intersectoral approach to decision making. Now, what happens that in our cities we have different departments who work in silos and they don't really interact with each other too. So, firstly, this calls for uh, all the departments to work together in a joint and participatory manner for better decision making. And on the other hand, you need to also consider the fact that once you're planning for water, it's not natural for us to think that, okay, maybe a planner should also be involved in it. Okay, maybe a biodiversity expert should also be involved. Maybe a forest department person should also be involved. So that is what this intersectoral approach looks at. You need to look at all the sectors that are directly or indirectly, say even transport, how they are impacting or being impacted by the decisions that we are making, and how we can work together. The last principle is that integrating management means that we receive multiple benefits from a single intervention. For example, if you undertake an activity for plantation, that is not only protecting your floodplain, that is not only purifying the runoff that is entering into your river, it also helps reduce the flooding, it also helps uh, mitigate climate change impact. It also captures carbon. It also provides hub for biodiversity. So, there are multiple benefits that you need to look at. Unfortunately, what happens is that whatever proposals most governments think of, they only think of hard infrastructural approaches. We'll probably just build a dam here, we'll build a wall there. These kind of approaches are much more common, but we need to realize that the gray infrastructure approaches might not be the only solution. You can probably have a better solution with green infrastructure as well.
Now, if we try and understand the hydrological cycle at the urban level, we can see water is received at the urban level in the form of precipitation, which might be rain or snow, which leads to surface water inflows and also groundwater inflows. Now, this water is used within the urban area through, surface water bodies, groundwater abstraction, stormwater flows. Stormwater means runoff generated after rainfall. Now, this water is abstracted and used as water supply from surface and groundwater sources. And then the wastewater, which is generated from urban settlements or even rural settlements, is called wastewater, which is generally very rich in nutrients also. But in most cases, this wastewater is discharged into the uh, either surface water bodies or groundwater bodies without adequate treatment. In very few cases, we see that the water is adequately treated and then discharged. In most cases, it is discharged without any treatment or with partial treatment and it's discharged into surface and groundwater resources, and the nutrients and water here are not recovered also. So this is, this is a sort of a linear flow wherein we take in water and we release water without abstracting, the the water resource and the nutrients from it. So there is a need to understand that we need to close this water loop, which includes water resource in all its forms: surface water, storm water, groundwater. It includes the water that is being used for supply and other uses. It includes the water that is being generated as waste. And it also includes the storm water flow that is being generated from precipitation. And recovering water and nutrients from all these aspects can help us close the water loop. And sanitation, waste management, and water sanitation hygiene, they are integrated parts of this water loop.
Okay, so let's look at some of the case studies. So the first case study is from Shimla, Himachal Pradesh. This is basically a study that I'd done in 2007 using 13 years of rainfall runoff data for Shimla area. These are the four catchments that I had looked at. And what you see on your right is how these catchments overlap with the the proposed land use plan for Shimla. This was the then proposed land use plan. Obviously, the proposed land use is going to be different now, but yeah, this shows how the two are linked. Okay, so let's see how a Himalayan catchment responds to rainfall events. What you see on your right side is the graphical representation. The upper one is the response of a forested catchment, and the lower one is the response of an urban catchment. Blue lines show the rainfall events, and red lines show the runoff generation. Now, if we look at a blow up, what you can see in these green boxes shows the response of a forested catchment, and you can see that much lesser runoff is generated. You can see less of those red lines being generated as compared to the urban catchment below, where you can see within these yellow boxes that a lot of runoff or red lines are being generated. Similarly, if we look at base flow, the forested catchment in this green box shows a lot of base flow generation, whereas in the urban catchment in this yellow box below, you can see that there's hardly any base flow. And base flow is very, very important for countries like India, where most of the rainfall happens within 3 or 4 months, and you have a lot of rivers running dry during the summers. I think you can manually move it a bit forward. Took up four catchments, and the same amount of urbanization was. So another aspect that I looked at was how is a catchment impacted if the same amount of urbanization happens to various different catchments. So I took up four catchments, and the same amount of urbanization was modeled on all these four catchments, and the response of the catchment in terms of the impact on water runoff generation varied across these catchments. And the parameters that determined how this response would vary were topography, which means whether you have a steep slope catchment or you have a gentle slope catchment, whether you have high forest cover or low forest cover, what kind of land use do you have in the catchment, and also a combination of these above factors. So if you want to understand how your city or your catchment is going to behave and how is it going to respond to more urbanization in future, then you should consider its impact on these factors. And as I've said, forests are very crucial at retaining base flow, and base flow is very important for countries like ours because it helps recharge. It also reduces flooding downstream, and it is also going to be very important because such events are going to increase in the future with climate change. Moisture deficits run so deep. Okay, so as I discussed before, one of the important findings of the study was that, soil moisture deficits run so deep in the soil that they can even reach the weathered bedrock. And when your rainfall falls, especially in mountainous regions, it can reach the bedrock and can keep on flowing gradually along the surface of the weathered bedrock. The fractures, the crevices in the terrain, and then it can gradually reappear and resurface after several months or days or even hours after the rainfall event. And this is very important because we found that these springs have an important role in the base flow that mountain rivers especially have during the lean period or the summer period. So that is why it is important that we recognize the importance of these springs and conserve their catchments. Now, the catchment of a spring can be located in, say 100 kilometers from where the spring actually emerges. But it is very important to retain a buffer wherever you can around the stream, around the catchment, so that these natural processes are conserved. This time delay is very crucial because it helps water being available during the lean period, and it helps build resilience to climate events. Now, this is another case study from Burhanpur, Madhya Pradesh. This is close to Indore, Khandwa region of Madhya Pradesh. Now, what you can see here is the Satpura ranges. This is all the Satpura ranges, and this here is the Tapti river. And what you can see here is Burhanpur city. So essentially, the city is located along the foothills of Satpura and along the banks of Tapti. So the runoff from the Satpuras flows in this direction towards Tapti, and this city of Burhanpur has a very unique feature. It's called the Kundi Bhandara. It is an underground water tunnel which runs from the foothills of the mountains to the river, and this is a man-made structure. So it's a 17th century Kannauj system which was built during the reign of Akbar. It was designed by Khan Khanan. The idea was that Akbar did not want his army to get poisoned by the enemy, who was capable of poisoning Tapti. So he wanted to have a backup water resource system, and that is why this was built as an underground tunnel system. So you can see these are the walls of that underground tunnel, and one can actually walk through this entire tunnel. And this white thing that you see is actually the calcium deposits that have formed on the walls of that tunnel over the centuries. So basically, as you can see here in this diagram, the runoff from the Satpura gradually flows through the entire slope and meets Tapti River. And these are kundis or wells that have been made into the tunnel along the slope to access water from this tunnel. So it used to initially have a discharge of at least 1 mld, but now it has gone down to around 0.4 mld over the years. As I said, because you have a lot of degradation of Satpura forests happening, you have climate change impacts, you have a lot of calcium magnesium deposits happening along the walls of the Bhandara itself, and there are anthropogenic interferences, and also the structure is at least 300 odd years old. So, and the structure was even used to supply water to the city until pretty recently.
So now I'll talk about some of the works that we're doing in this area to spread awareness on climate change and sustainable development. We do a lot of training programs and awareness programs, especially with youth and children. This is an example of a training program for architecture students to sensitize them on water and climate change related aspects. These architecture students were from Maharashtra, which is a drought prone state of India. This is another training program that we did with youth from Rajasthan. Rajasthan is a desert state of India, and the youth that we addressed here were to be teachers. So we tried to sensitize these teachers so that they can further train students accordingly. We also played a very interesting game with these people on carbon credits. Two teams were formed, and they were given carbon. They were given money, which was in the form of carbon uh, points that they can spend on buying infrastructure to build their city. And they were given options to choose from in terms of green infrastructure and gray infrastructure, like electric, whether you'll go for electric vehicles or whether you'll go for fossil fuel driven vehicles, whether you'll go for coal based energy or whether you'll go for renewable energy. So these kind of options they were given, and at the end of the game, one group ended up completely spending all their carbon points, and the other group stopped in between and they said that we've spent enough. So at the end of it, they realized that the group that has spent all their carbon points has actually let out all the carbon into the atmosphere. So that was a good learning for the students. These are some images from that training program only. Now we've also done some on-ground activities. This is an activity which we did with the Tree Grace Foundation to clean the banks of Yamuna in and around Delhi area. So we tied up with the volunteers from Tree Grace Foundation, and we picked up the waste from the riverbed, and that was sent to the municipal disposal ground for segregation and adequate treatment. We do similar activities with other partners also. This is another similar activity where we undertook tree plantation with an environmentally aware group of citizens. So this is next to a recently revived pond. So we undertook plantation of trees so that this pond can become green in the future. This is a glimpse of a short course that we launched on understanding integrated water resource management in a better manner. So this included modules related to integrated water resource management, multi-stakeholder platforms, Indian experiences from the Ganga Basin and from Meghalaya, which is the northeastern state of India. We had a good number of participants from many countries for this course. Then we also hosted the Urban Thinkers Campus. The topic of discussion was critical urban infrastructure with focus on water resource management. We had four prominent panelists and prominent members for discussion. Some of the themes that were discussed were urban wetland management guidelines, critical infrastructure, and how the community can, how the community can change its outlook from surviving to thriving, nature-based wastewater treatment methods, and disaster and climate resilient water supply systems. This is another series of webinars that we took on water resource management. Some of the topics that were covered included water and climate change, importance of water conservation, and how the climate change and water aspects were impacted during the pandemic. Then what is the catchment-based approach to planning? And over this webinar series, we had, I think if I'm not wrong, more than 500 people from more than 50 countries register for these events. This is these are another few of those where we had Mr. Stephen Liaros coming in to talk about circular economy villages, and we had Boega from Nigeria talking about startups in the climate change sector, and we had Mr. Anand talk about lake rejuvenation. And these are some of the awards and recognitions that we've received. We have given a lot of presentations at national and international platforms on aspects related to water and climate change. And I was also the finalist for the UK Alumni Awards for Social Impact India for the year 2018. And these are some of the other recognitions that we've got from Action for India and from IIT, which is an Indian Institute of Technology, Kharagpur. And just want to end with this, that the pandemic has given us a new baseline. Now, what we imagined could not be achieved in our lifetimes is something that we've seen with our own eyes. The way environment recovered and bounced back during the lockdown is something that is that is a dream for most environmentally and most environment and climate professionals in the country, and also the enthusiasts and youth who want the environment restored. So we have a new baseline, a new dream. The point is that are we willing to chase it? And with this, I would like to close my presentation. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Meesha, for your brilliant presentation and for sharing your expertise in the topic of water resource management, and for also sharing information on your first-hand information on your on the ground realities of the situation in various parts in India. I would now like to begin with the Q&A session, and I understand there are a few questions that have come in the chat box, and I would like to invite my colleague Kirsty to who will moderate the Q&A session for us today.
Thank you, Eva, and thank you, Meesha, for that fantastic presentation and for such interesting information about the work that you're involved in. There's been a lot of questions coming through in the chat box, so thank you to everybody for submitting those. I'm going to go with the first question for our speaker, which is asking, how has the COVID-19 pandemic affected climate change? And is there any study that movement control reduced temperature rise / climate change? Is there any study in that area? So that's the first question for our speaker.
Right. Thanks, Eva, and thanks, Kirsty, and the team from Commonwealth for having me. And it's a great opportunity to be here. Now, to answer this question, the impacts of pandemic, these were monitored, around the end of the first pandemic. And frankly speaking, there were major changes, like, the emissions from transport reduced significantly across the world. And I, in another presentation, do have the actual figures also, but off the top of my mind, what I can say is that yes, there were significant reductions in the emissions during the period of the lockdowns across the world. But what happened was that after the lockdown opened and the economy started, recovering, especially after this one, the rise has also been, quite significant. So in a way, the overall emissions were reduced, but only marginally because of the pandemic. But they weren't that significant that it can actually impact the global carbon budget to a great extent.
Thank you so much for that response. And I think it's something that there is a few sort of different data sources with that information. And I'm sure that's something that you would be happy to share in our knowledge hubs, or if you do share the link with Eva, she can circulate it to our attendees. So thank you for that first question. Another one that has come in is, what are the ethical issues to be considered when addressing the water competition?
Well, if I understand your question correctly, you mean water conflicts, competing users of water. Well, there are definitely ethical issues, but as we all know, in different parts of the world, the marginalized do suffer. But what happens is that countries set their priorities, that, this is the order of priority for which I'll use water. If you specifically talk about India, I think its first is drinking, second is irrigation, third I think is navigation and industries. So there is a sequence and a priority which the countries allocate to water usage, but obviously drinking is the prime priority. And the problem actually comes in wherein you have differential access to water. For example, a lot of the marginalized populations do not have access to, tap water or treated water. So they end up drinking water from sources which are not really fit for drinking. And also the problem happens in case of states like, we have some southern states in India which are constantly in a conflict for water use for irrigation. This happens for the Kaveri water, and it's an annual conflict. And the problem is that none of the states are realizing that they need to become more decentralized in their water resource management. You need to develop localized water resources so that your dependence on large dams and structures reduces. So yeah, to answer your question, I think there are definitely ethical issues, and the marginalized communities are most of the times not catered to adequately. But there are obviously government schemes that try to cater to this aspect, but only with some success.
Thank you so much for that comprehensive response to quite a big question, particularly around sort of the ethics of this water competition that you've raised in the presentation. Another question that's come in, and firstly, a thank you from one of our attendees. They're saying thank you for the time-demanding emerging presentation. So that's fantastic to hear. They've asked, could you explain a bit about the virtual water trade scenario of India within the neighbouring countries like Bangladesh and other countries under SAARC?
Just let me read this question. Explain a bit about the virtual water trade scenario in India. Well, I mean, I do not have the figures for this, frankly, but virtual water is actually quite significant in the case of India. And when you talk about trade with Bangladesh and other SAARC countries, uh, there's definitely a huge water footprint that the products have. And, when we are importing, especially exporting and importing, especially like, from Bangladesh, we import rice, if I'm not wrong, and rice is highly water consumptive crop. And, we also have garment imports and exports happening between the two countries, which are also rather water intensive, and their virtual water footprint goes on for miles. So yeah, I'm sorry, I cannot give you any numbers on this, but all I can say is that the water footprints and the virtual water usage is quite significant in these trades. Yes.
Thank you so much for that response. We have 3 more questions, I believe, in the chat box, and I'm conscious of time, so I just want to check with you, Meesha, that you're fine to just go over maybe sort of 5-6 minutes just to finish off the Q&A.
Sure.
Perfect. Thank you so much. So the next question that's come in, which is asking, how can we equitably balance the country's domestic water requirement vis-a-vis other development projects, including agricultural irrigation, industrial development, amongst others?
Right. So I think the answer to this is linked to what I'd said earlier. For example, every nation has this priority set for water usage, wherein drinking is the top priority. And then, for example, there's a water reservoir and you have to decide on the allocation of water from that water resource. So say if 3 cities are dependent on it for water supply, their drinking water supply would be given the first priority, and then your demand for irrigation and all will be met from that. In a scenario in a year where you do not get adequate water and the dam does not fill up, then the priority would be given to ensure that you have year's supply for the cities that you're catering to for drinking water supply, and for the irrigation demand as far as possible. And then the other uses tend to be neglected. But what is also something important that we tend to forget a lot of times in this, that is that when we are damming rivers, we are actually cutting the water supply of the entire ecosystem into bits and pieces, and then it fragments the ecosystem. Ecosystems are generally interlinked. They function as a web of interlinkages between various organisms and flora and fauna and all kinds of organisms. And once you fragment the ecosystem, some parts of the ecosystem might be able to thrive, but the others might not. So that is also something that you need to be very careful of while we are planning for the human use. The environmental use of water should also be considered. That is why in India it has been made mandatory that whichever dams are there, they'll have to on a mandatory basis leave an E-flow, which is called as an environmental flow, which is the minimum flow that your rivers should have in the lean season. I hope I answered your question. Thank you.
Thank you again for another really comprehensive response. There's a myriad of different things to take into consideration there. Another question, and firstly, another thanks from an attendee saying thank you for a very informative presentation. Their question is, in the midst of this climate emergency, are there some opportunities from these extreme events that we can harness, especially to address the water crisis?
Most definitely. And I think, especially for startups, there's a huge scope. If I talk about the context of water in specific, there are instances like floods and droughts and, cyclone related events also. So, there is a huge demand for early warning systems, demand, and I would say rather a need also for early warning systems, which can alert the residents living in the neighboring areas that, okay, it has rained in the upper catchment, so there is a probability that your city might flood. So, they have some time to either evacuate the place, and the authorities have the time to take necessary action. Then, there, because of the pollution levels in the rivers, there's extensive need for instrumentation of river basins to understand where the pollution is increasing and what are the sources of it. So that's another huge area where startups can play an important role. Another, I would say, is the disaster management aspect itself. So we see that a lot of countries have robust mechanisms to address the needs for disaster management in case of floods or droughts. But what we also need to understand is that these are mostly limited to sudden interventions which are made in the instance of a flood or a drought striking. But there's also a need to build the capacity of the communities over a period of time to ensure that when a disaster strikes, the communities are prepared for it. And that requires a lot of working with the community, not just to train them and to sensitize them, but also to build the relevant infrastructure. For example, in case of a disaster, you'll need your critical infrastructure meaning your basic infrastructure, without which survival would be difficult. For example, your water supply systems and your electricity and other systems. So there's an immediate need for these systems to bounce back after a disaster, but in most cases these systems take a long time to recover from disasters. And in such cases, there is a need for decentralized systems of infrastructure which can help you recover from a disaster. For example, you can have decentralized solar panels which can help you bounce back in case of a disaster impacting your power grid. Things like this. Then another aspect I would say is related to food security, because drought and food security are linked. And there are interventions towards precision agriculture that are being made, which help in making crops more efficient. So they use less water, they use less nutrients, and the produce is more. And even in case of a disaster striking, the farmers are made aware that a sudden rain or a storm is about to come. So if you are planning to harvest 4 days later, I think it's best to harvest now and save your crops from this disaster. So yeah, these are some of the areas that I can think of off the top of my head, but definitely there is a huge scope, especially for the drinking water supply provision, because uh, if you see the sustainable development goals, SDG 6 is completely dedicated to water. And in case of increasing disasters, the problem is that you also have a setback in terms of the development that you've already achieved. So, these disasters sort of tend to push you back in your development ladder. And then it becomes very important to make your infrastructure resilient to disasters in the future. I think that's what I would like to say for that.
Thank you again for that comprehensive response. There's a lot of different things that require consideration, and I think it's a very fine balance from what you've presented there that is required. So there's two more questions that we will move through. So if anyone still has questions, unfortunately we won't have time in the webinar, but there will be an opportunity if you want to connect with Meesha via LinkedIn. So the second last question is from the same attendee. They've got another question in here. In your opinion, how important is Indigenous knowledge and local adaptation practices from local people in addressing climate extremes? And is it relevant in achieving Goal 13 of the SDGs, that goal that you've just mentioned previously?
Right. So goal 13 towards climate action is very, very important. And the role of indigenous communities is very, very important. I think in the recently concluded COP, they also recognized that these indigenous species are key to conserving the ecosystems and their role should be acknowledged. So yeah, local adaptation is very, very important, and there are a lot of practices that local people do. For example, in India, I talked about the traditional rainwater harvesting systems. These are traditionally made structures which are made without any scientific knowledge and research, and they're made by the traditional communities, and these structures have lasted our communities for over centuries of droughts in a desert region of India. And such wealth of wisdom is present all over the country, and I'm sure all over the world. And there is a specific need to conserve and protect this information. There are a lot of organizations that are working towards documenting these kind of practices, so as to ensure that they don't die out with this generation and they're there for the next generation to take forward. For example, in India also, there is a lady who's called the doctor of the forests, and she has been she's completely from the indigenous community, and she has been given one of the highest awards in India recently. So yes, it is very, very important to not let developers encroach upon the areas which are conserved by these indigenous communities, and to give a lot of respect to their knowledge and document them to the extent possible.
Great. No, thank you so much for that answer to that question around Indigenous knowledge and local communities. So the final question from our attendees is, how can water supplies be adapted to reduce the impact of climate change?
Right. So there are a lot of aspects of water supply that you need to look at. For example, like I talked in my presentation, don't look at water alone, look at the entire water cycle. So in terms of your water supply, you have surface water sources, you have groundwater sources, you have precipitation, which gives you storm water. You need to firstly regulate and control the use of all this so that it's done in a sustainable manner. And in a lot of places, what happens is that we are over exploiting our water resources, and that leads to stress on this uh, on the resources themselves and on the society also for the future. Because if you're depleting a source, then your future is not sustainable, and you don't have water security for your future. So firstly, I think it's most important that you look at the entire water loop, how you can, don't treat wastewater as water that has been that is rubbish. You can recover water from that, you can recover nutrients from that, and you can reuse it, and you can reduce the stress on your existing water resources. You can also do rainwater harvesting, which is much needed to help the groundwater replenishment. You can look at options for the SCADA and 24/7 related water supply measures, which can help reduce the leakage losses in your water supply lines. So in many cities in India, the leakage losses are of the tune of 30 to 50%, and some can even go as high as 60% or so. And I think as far as I understand, in UK also, this might be the case in some areas because of the old water supply lines and the infrastructure which has been laid out earlier on. And there are a lot of levels at which you can intervene to make water supplies resistant to climate change. Like I said, first is the source of water, then how you supply the water, then awareness of your users. What happens is that in the Indian context, what is happening is that some cities which are consuming right now 70 liters per capita per day are being upgraded so that they can receive 135 liters per capita per day. But you also need to think whether you have enough water to actually be able to increase that demand. People store water and use it judiciously when they are being given 70 liters per capita per day. But then if you're going to consistently increase it and not make sure that the water, the efficiency with which users are using water is maintained, then that is, I think, a loss. You actually need to work like Singapore. Singapore has this policy where they're not targeting increasing per capita supply. What they're targeting is how they can make their users aware and reduce the per capita supply that they have to give to their population, because they are stressed for water resources, and India also is. But India's approach is not yet that evolved to be able to understand that there is a need for reduction in per capita supply also. So yeah, many aspects. And as I said, circular economies of water is something that you can also look at, wherein you can recover more than just wastewater from the discharges that are coming out of the city. You can recover water, you can recover nutrients, you can recover a lot of elements which can also act as fertilizers for the crops that are going. So yeah, there's a lot that can be done.
Well, thank you again for that comprehensive answer. As mentioned, I'm going to bring the Q&A to a close as we have gone over time. We don't want to keep everybody for longer than we said we would, but thank you again, Meesha, for your presentation and also for your responses to our attendee questions. There are a couple that are still coming into the chat box, so you might want to have a look at those, but I'm going to hand over to my colleague Eva, who will wrap up today's webinar and tell a little bit more information about how people can connect with you with more questions.
Thank you so much, Kirsty, for managing the chat box and also presenting the questions that have come through in the chat box to our speaker, Meesha. And Meesha, thank you so much for responding to all the questions brilliantly. It just shows your in-depth knowledge and expertise on the area. So thank you so much for responding to the questions. We do understand if we have any questions in the chat box that have not been answered, please feel free to get in touch with Meesha on LinkedIn. You can see her name as mentioned on LinkedIn on your screen. Meesha will be more than happy to connect with you for further discussions or to answer any additional questions you might have regarding her webinar presentation. With this, we come to a close of the webinar. Thank you so much, attendees, for joining us today and for engaging with us through your questions, through your comments in the chat box, and for listening to the webinar presentation by Meesha. Meesha, on behalf of the CSE, thank you so much for your presentation, and we look forward to any further connections through LinkedIn that you will have with our Commonwealth scholars and alumni and the wider CSE community. Thank you so much for your presentation.
Thank you so much for having me.